Rosalie Bennett slammed both hands on that saloon table so hard the glasses rattled, and every man in the room went dead silent. "Don't drink that, sir." Her voice cracked the air like a whip. The stranger's glass was already at his lips, one swallow away from a coffin. She had seen Hector's shaking hands. She had seen Victor Halston's nod from the corner. She had heard what no one was supposed to hear. And God help her, she screamed anyway. In a room full of men who looked away, a woman everyone had written off chose to be the only one who spoke. If this is your first time here, please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment and tell me what city you are watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let us get into part 1. The glass never reached his mouth. Caleb Rourke set it down on the bar with a slow, deliberate click and turned toward the voice. Not because he was startled, not because he was grateful. He set it down because in 10 years of living dangerously, he had learned that the only voices worth listening to were the ones that cost something to say, and that voice had just cost that woman everything in this room. Every head had turned. Every conversation had stopped. The piano player lifted his hands off the keys mid-note. The card game in the corner froze 5 men holding their cards and staring at the same point in the room. And that point was Rosalie Bennett, standing at a back table, with her hands pressed flat to the wood and her face flushed deep red and her chin lifted like she was daring the room to say something about what she had just done. Nobody said anything. That was almost worse. Caleb took her in without moving. Mid-20s, dark hair coming loose from its pins. A round face, full cheeks, a body that certain women in hard country carried broad and solid. The kind of frame that came from working land and eating what the land gave and not apologizing for either. Her calico dress had been mended at the left sleeve. Her boots were worn at the heel. She was not the kind of woman this room was accustomed to noticing, and he could see in the faces around him the particular expression of men, recalibrating, trying to decide what it meant that someone like her had just detonated the silence of the Dusty Crown on a Tuesday night. He saw the moment they decided it meant nothing good for her. "Well," said a man at the nearest table, low and amused. "Rosalie Bennett's got opinions tonight." A ripple of laughter. Quiet, dismissive. The specific cruelty of people who have decided that someone does not deserve to be taken seriously, and who use laughter as the instrument of that verdict. Rosalie did not flinch. Her eyes stayed on Caleb. "Please," she said, quieter now. The room had gone back to its noise deliberately, performatively, the way rooms do when they have collectively decided not to witness something. "Please, sir, don't drink it." Caleb looked at the glass. Then he looked at the bartender. Hector was a thick-necked man with a face built for blending in, and he was doing his level best to blend in right now. Eyes fixed somewhere above Caleb's left shoulder. Hands very still on the bar, in the way that hands go still when their owner is afraid of what they might do if they move. Caleb had seen that stillness before. He knew what it meant. He knew what it meant about the glass, too. "Hector!" The voice came from the far corner of the room, and it was not loud, but the room heard it anyway. The room always heard Victor Halston, because the room had learned over many years that not hearing Victor Halston was a dangerous habit. "Come here, please." Hector moved out from behind the bar with the stiff mechanical obedience of a man who has long since stopped asking himself whether he has a choice. He crossed the room and bent to the corner table and received his instructions and straightened and walked directly to Rosalie. Caleb watched every step of it. "Rosalie." Hector's voice was not unkind. Somehow that made it worse. "Mr. Halston would like a word." Victor Halston sat in a chair slightly too fine for the establishment around it, the kind of man who carried his own comfort into every room and arranged the room accordingly. 60 perhaps, silver-haired. A face that had been handsome once and had since settled into something colder and more durable, the face of a man who had made many decisions and never lost sleep over any of them. His suit was dark wool and cost more than most men in this building made in 2 months. Behind his chair stood 2 larger men with the particular quality of stillness that meant they were not there for conversation. I was looking at Rosalie with an expression of absolute unhurried calm. That was the thing about Victor Halston that this town had learned to fear most. Not the anger. The calm. "I'd rather stand, Mr. Halston," Rosalie said. The room caught its breath. Caleb pushed back from the bar. He stood and something shifted in the air around him. Nothing dramatic, no hand near a weapon, no raised voice. Simply the quality of stillness that certain men carry when they have decided that the next thing that happens is going to happen differently than the person in charge of the room has planned. Several men near him edged sideways without quite knowing why. "I believe the lady was speaking to me," Caleb said. Victor looked at him for the first time. The look was comprehensive and brief, the assessment of a man accustomed to evaluating obstacles. He found Caleb's worn jacket and his road-worn boots and his unremarkable height, and he made his calculation. "This is a private matter," Victor said. "I'd ask you not to involve yourself." "She involved herself in mine," Caleb said. "Seems only fair I return it." He crossed the room without invitation. Not fast nothing about Caleb Rourke was ever fast in a way that announced itself, but deliberate, each step placed with the quiet certainty of a man who has decided where he is going and is simply closing the distance. He stopped at the table where Rosalie was standing and put himself between her and the direction of the corner with no particular drama. Simply moved to where he was needed and stopped. He heard her exhale behind his right shoulder. One sharp small breath. Released tension. "My name is Caleb Rourke," he said to Victor. He had not intended to give anyone in this town his name, but names were declarations sometimes, and this felt like a moment that called for one. "I'm passing through. I don't have a stake in your arrangements here, and I generally prefer to keep it that way. But I'd like to thank this young woman for her warning, and I'd like to see her leave this room without any difficulty." Victor turned his brandy glass slowly in his fingers. "You're passing through?" "Yes, sir." "Then I'd suggest you pass through quickly." The smile that followed was not unfriendly. That was the most dangerous thing about it. Willow Creek is a fine town for men who understand how things work here. And for men who don't. Considerably less fine. Caleb nodded once. The slow, deliberate nod of a man filing something away. He turned to Rosalie. "Ma'am," he said. "Shall we?" She looked up at him. She had to look up. He had several inches on her, and he watched the calculation happen behind her eyes. She was frightened. He could see it clearly now that he was close enough. The set of her jaw, the slight tension around her mouth, the way her hands had gone white-knuckled against the table. She was frightened, and she had been frightened since the moment she opened her mouth, and she had done it anyway. And now she was deciding whether the new element standing in front of her was an improvement on her situation or a complication of it. He waited. He did not rush her. "Yes," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Rourke." They walked out together, and the room let them go. And behind them, Caleb heard the conversation restart the deliberate performative noise of a room that had collectively decided not to have witnessed anything at all. He heard underneath it the sound of Victor Halston's voice, very quiet, giving instructions to someone. He noted that too. Outside the air, hit cold and clean, and Rosalie stopped the moment the doors closed behind them and turned to face him. And he saw what she had been holding together inside the fear she had been keeping controlled for the benefit of an audience. It was showing more plainly now. Her hands were trembling. She pressed them together and made them stop. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Not especially," she said. He almost smiled. He respected honesty more than composure. "What was in the glass?" "Something Hector's wife told the laundress who told—" She stopped. "It doesn't matter how I heard. I heard what I heard, and I saw what I saw." "You knew what it would cost you to say something." "I knew." "And you said it anyway." "I said it anyway." He looked at her in the dark for a moment. "That was a very foolish and very brave thing to do, Miss Bennett," she said. "Rosalie Bennett, and I know how it looked." "It looked like the only decent thing anyone in that room did tonight," Caleb said. "That's how it looked." Something moved across her face. Not quite surprise. More like the expression of a person who has braced for a blow and felt it land somewhere unexpected, somewhere it didn't hurt. "He'll come for you now," Caleb said. "After tonight. You understand that." "He's been coming for us for 2 years," she said. And then before he could ask, she told him. She told it the way people tell things that have been held too long. Not in order, not cleanly, with the weight distributed unevenly across the details that mattered most. Caleb listened. He had learned that listening was the most useful skill he carried. Her father, Thomas, had built the Bennett property 12 years ago with $40, and the particular stubbornness of a man who believed that land worked with your own hands became something more than land. He died 4 years back, fever that moved faster than the doctor in the next county could travel. Since then, it had been Rosalie and her mother Martha, two women who had decided that grief would not be the thing that finished them. Victor Halston wanted the creek access their property controlled. Without it, his southern expansion stalled. He had offered money. Martha refused. He had sent men to explain his interest more directly. Martha had met them on the porch with Thomas's old rifle and a manner that left no room for interpretation. He had applied pressure through the business community. They had adapted. He had questioned their legal title. Their title was clean. 3 weeks ago, someone blocked our water line, Rosalie said. Her voice stayed level. Practiced. Took 2 days to find it. 2 weeks ago, the man who bought eggs from Mama every week stopped coming. Last week, she paused. The pause cost her something. Last week, someone shot at our dog. Hit him. No. The word came out unsteady. She pulled it back. Chester's old and deaf, and he didn't understand what the sound was. He's fine. Good. She looked at him sharply, like she had expected something more complicated than that single word, and didn't know what to do with its simplicity. Tonight I came in for flour, she continued. The walls between the general store and the saloon are thin. I heard Hector getting his instructions. I heard enough to understand. Her jaw tightened. The man in that corner didn't even know your name. You were just convenient. Someone whose death could send a message to the next person who tried to stand against him. Caleb was quiet for a moment. What message? That no one is safe, not even strangers. She looked at him directly. That help doesn't come from outside Willow Creek, because anyone who tries ends up dead. The cold came down harder off the ridge. Somewhere far off, a coyote started working through its thoughts. Caleb stood in the dark and thought about the glass he had almost lifted, and the woman who had stopped him, and the man sitting in the corner of a saloon with his fine suit and his calm smile, and 2 decades of practice at making entire towns into instruments of his will. Take me to meet your mother, he said. Rosalie went still. Why? Because whatever's coming next is going to come fast, and it's going to come at your property, and I'd rather know the ground before it does. You said you were passing through. I was, Caleb said. Plans change. She studied him for a long moment in the dark. He let her study. He had nothing to hide and nowhere to... And he understood that this woman had every right to look at him with caution. A stranger who inserted himself into your danger was not automatically an asset. He had been the wrong kind of help to people before. He knew what that looked like. He was asking her to trust that this was different, and he knew that was a significant ask. How do I know, she said carefully, that you're not another one of his arrangements? A friendlier approach after the first one failed. It was a good question. It was the question of a woman who had been operating in enemy territory long enough to understand how deception worked. He respected it. You don't, he said. Not yet. But I'd point out that a man Victor Halston sent wouldn't have let you walk me out of that building. He'd have made sure I stayed. She thought about this. Then she turned and started walking north on the main road without another word, and after a moment, he fell into step beside her. The Bennett property came into view as they topped a rise farmhouse barn, a garden that had been worked with care and intention. One lamp burned in the front window, Martha keeping watch. Rosalie went ahead to the house. Caleb waited at the gate and heard voices low and urgent. Then the door opened and a woman appeared in the lamplight. Martha Bennett was perhaps 50, weathered in the way of women who had been carrying things for years and had arranged the weight so that it didn't show. She came to the gate and looked at Caleb with the frank measuring gaze of someone who had long since stopped pretending that strangers appearing at her property after dark were necessarily friendly. Mr. Rourke, she said. East Tennessee and her vowels the geography of somewhere far from here and a long time ago. My daughter tells me you almost got yourself buried tonight. Almost, Caleb agreed. She tells me you walked her home. Yes, ma'am. Martha studied him. The lamplight barely reached this far, and she was working mostly on instinct. He stood still and let her work. Victor Halston sent 2 men to this gate last month, she said. One of them was polite too. I imagine he was, Caleb said. You're not him, Martha said. It was not a question. It was a conclusion reached through whatever process this woman used to read people, and he understood that the conclusion mattered. No, ma'am, I'm not. She held the gate open. Coffee's on. Inside the kitchen was small and warm, and arranged with the particular ordered practicality of people who had learned to be careful with what they had. The table was scrubbed clean. A Bible sat on the shelf near the window, thick old the kind that accumulated generations. Caleb registered it the way he registered everything in a room he had just entered. Force of habit. Martha poured without being asked. Rosalie sat across from where Caleb settled, and they looked at each other in the better light, and he saw what he had not fully seen outside how young she was underneath the steadiness. How much of that steadiness had been constructed rather than natural built piece by piece out of necessity. He'll come tomorrow, Caleb said. Or the night after. He can't wait longer than that. He's come before, Martha said. This is different. Your daughter stood up in front of his whole operation tonight. In his town, in front of his people. He looked at Martha steadily. He can't let that stand, not without answering it. Martha set her cup down. So what do you propose, Mr. Rourke? I propose you let me stay a few days, Caleb said. Look at your property, understand what you're working with. And then we see what he sends, and we figure out how to answer it. Silence. The lamp threw warm light across the table. Outside, the wind moved along the ridge and something creaked in the barn. Chester, probably the old deaf dog, redistributing himself in the dark. Mama, Rosalie said quietly. She wasn't asking for a decision. She was just saying the word. A small anchor. Martha looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she looked back at Caleb, and something settled in her face. Not trust exactly, not yet, but the particular decision of a woman who has run out of alternatives and has chosen to act on the best information available, rather than wait for perfect information that will never come. Loft in the barn's warm enough, she said. Chester won't bother you. He's mostly deaf. I heard he almost got shot last week, Caleb said. Martha's eyes went sharp and then unexpectedly soft. Whoever they sent didn't account for Chester being the stubbornest animal in 3 counties, she said. He moved at exactly the wrong moment, or the right one depending on how you look at it. I'd say the right one, Caleb said. So would I. He finished his coffee and thanked her, and went out to the barn and found the loft and lay down in the dark with the smell of hay and old wood around him. And Chester somewhere below, breathing in the slow, unbothered rhythm of a dog who has survived worse than a bullet and knows it. He stared at the dark above him and thought about the man in the corner with his fine suit and his calm smile. He thought about the glass he had almost lifted. He thought about a woman's voice cracking and terrified and absolutely certain detonating across a room full of people who had all decided that the decent thing to do was look away. He thought about what it meant to owe a debt to someone who didn't want it collected. He thought about the Bible on the shelf near the kitchen window. The old one, thick with years. There had been something about the way Martha's eyes had moved to it when he mentioned Victor coming. Something involuntary, something that happened before she controlled it. He filed that away. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, he did not dream about the things he had done. He dreamed about a voice that had cost everything to say, and said itself anyway. And when he woke before dawn to the wind and the dark and the distant sound of Willow Creek moving over its stones in the cold, he already knew that he was not leaving. Not yet. Not until whatever Victor Halston was sending toward this family had been met and answered and finished. How was done running. He just hadn't known it until a woman who had no reason to save him decided to save him anyway. And he intended to make sure that decision was worth every price she was about to pay for it. Howe was already awake when they came, not because he had heard anything. Not because Chester had barked. Chester was deaf and old, and had long since decided that the world's disturbances were someone else's problem. Caleb was awake because 3 years of sleeping in places where waking up late meant not waking up at all had rewired something deep in his nervous system, and that rewiring had pulled him out of the dark at 4 in the morning, with his hand already moving toward the revolver beside him before his eyes were fully open. He lay still and listened. Boots. 2 sets, maybe 3. Moving around the south side of the barn, not toward it. Around it the way men move when they are mapping a property rather than approaching it directly. Careful, methodical. The kind of movement that meant someone had sent people who knew what they were doing. Caleb rose without sound. He went to the loft's small window and looked out and saw them 2 men crossing the yard between the barn and the house, walking slow, looking at the fencing and the water line and the angle of the porch and the distance from the road. One of them had a lantern held low, throwing just enough light to see by without advertising themselves to the house, surveying. Victor Halston had sent surveyors in the middle of the night, and that told Caleb something important. This was not a man who moved on emotion. This was a man who planned. He watched them complete their circuit and leave back the way they had come, and then he lay back down in the loft and stared at the dark and did not sleep again. When the sun came up, he went to the house. Martha was already at the stove, which did not surprise him. He had the impression that Martha Bennett had been up before dawn every day for the last 4 years, making coffee and deciding to continue. Rosalie was at the table with her hands wrapped around a cup still in yesterday's clothes, dark circles under her eyes that said she had not slept either. She looked up when he came in. "You heard them," she said. Not a question. 2 men, south side. They were mapping the property. Martha set a cup in front of him without turning around. "They've done it before," she said. "First time was 6 months ago. We found boot tracks in the mud by the creek. Second time." She paused. "Second time, they left a dead rabbit on the porch." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "A message. A message," Martha said flatly. She finally turned from the stove, and her face was composed in the way of a woman who had decided a long time ago that if she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what was being done to her, she would not be able to function, and functioning was more important. "Mr. Rourke, I want to ask you something directly." "Yes, ma'am." "What exactly do you intend to do?" Caleb wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "I intend to understand what he's building toward," he said. "A man doesn't survey a property at 4 in the morning just to scare people. He's preparing for something specific. Legal most likely, or something that looks legal." "He's tried legal," Rosalie said. "Our title is clean." "Then he's working on making it not clean," Caleb said. "Or on finding another angle. Who's the county assessor?" Martha and Rosalie exchanged a look. "Man named Gideon Price," Martha said. "Been assessor for 11 years. He in Halston's pocket, another look between them, shorter this time." "We don't know for certain," Rosalie said carefully. "But," Caleb pressed. "But Gideon Price has a very nice new horse," Martha said, "and a very new suit, and his wife has been wearing a brooch that didn't come from any store in this county." She picked up her coffee. "Draw your own conclusions." Caleb drew them. "I need to go into town," he said. "Alone. I need to understand the shape of what Halston controls before we can figure out where the gaps are." "It won't be safe for you," Rosalie said. "After last night." "After last night, he's still deciding what I am," Caleb said. "A drifter who got lucky or a problem. I'd rather find out which before he makes up his mind." He finished his coffee and stood. He was almost to the door when Martha spoke. "Mr. Rourke." He turned. She was looking at him with an expression he could not quite categorize. Not warm, not cold, somewhere in the particular territory of a woman who has learned to withhold judgment until she has more information and who is currently gathering it. "My husband used to say that a man who asks the right questions already knows half the answers," she said. "You've been asking the right questions." "I've had practice," Caleb said. "I know," she said. "That's what concerns me. And it's also what makes me glad you're here." He walked into town with his collar up and his hat pulled low and his mind running ahead of him, mapping what he already knew onto the physical geography of Willow Creek. The saloon, the general store, The assessor's office, which would be in the county building on the east end of the main street. The church white-painted set back from the road on the north side of town, the kind of building that served as the community's conscience, whether the community wanted one or not. The first person who saw him on the main street and looked away too quickly was the man from the general store. The second was a woman coming out of the laundry with a basket who suddenly found something very interesting in the opposite direction. By the third, Caleb understood that word had moved through Willow Creek overnight, and the word was that the stranger at the Dusty Crown was something other than a simple passing through. Good. Let them look. Let Victor Halston know that he had not run. He went to the barber first because barbers knew everything and charged very little for the information relative to its value, and because a man getting a shave had a legitimate reason to sit still and listen. The barber's name was Augusto, and he had a careful, watchful quality that Caleb associated with men who had learned in some previous life that information was a form of currency more stable than gold. New in town, Augusto said. It wasn't a question. Passing through, Caleb said. Stayed longer than I planned. Augusto said nothing. He worked the brush around the shaving soap with the particular focused attention of a man who was listening with his whole body. Interesting town, Caleb offered. Victor Halston seems like an important man. The brush paused, just for a second, then continued. Mr. Halston has been very good for this town, Augusto said carefully. He employs a significant number of people. I imagine he does. The processing operation he's building on the south end will employ more. I imagine that too. Caleb kept his eyes on the ceiling. The Bennett property's in his way, I hear. The brush stopped again. This time it took longer to resume. I wouldn't know about that, Augusto said. No, Caleb said. Probably not. He paid and thanked the man and walked out, and he had what he needed. Not information exactly, but the shape of the silence around information. A town that knew things and had decided not to say them. A town that had been trained over a long period of time to understand that saying things had consequences. That kind of silence was hard to break, but it had seams. It always had seams. He found the first seam at the hardware store, in the form of a man named Dalt, who was maybe 70 years old, and had the particular freedom of a person who had decided they were past the age of being afraid of consequences. Dalt was sorting nails into a tin with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had been sorting nails his whole life and had discovered that it was in fact exactly as simple as it looked. You're the fella from last night, Dalt said without looking up. Word travels. It's a small town. Dalt dropped a handful of nails into the tin. You walked Rosalie Bennett home. I did. Good. Dalt's voice carried no particular emotion, just a verdict rendered. She's a good girl. Her mother's a good woman. Thomas Bennett was a good man. This town has not... He paused, selected a nail, examined it, placed it in the tin. This town has not covered itself in glory with regard to that family. No, Caleb said. It hasn't. Dalt looked up at him for the first time. Clear eyes the color of creek water. The look of a man who had seen a great deal and had made his peace with most of it and had not made his peace with this. What are you planning to do? He asked. Don't know yet. You know anything useful? Dalt was quiet for a moment. Then he reached under the counter and produced a folded piece of paper and set it flat on the wood between them. Man from the county land office came through 2 weeks ago, he said. I heard him in here talking to Roy Simmons. Roy works for Halston, does his legal running. I didn't hear all of it, but I heard enough to write down what I heard. He tapped the paper. That's what I wrote. You can have it. I'm too old for it to matter to me, and too old to pretend I don't know which way is right. Caleb took the paper and folded it into his breast pocket without opening it. Much obliged, he said. Don't thank me, Dalt said. He went back to his nails. Thank those 2 women for still being standing. Most people would have folded by now. Caleb left and walked to the far end of town and sat on a bench outside the feed store and unfolded Dalt's paper. The handwriting was old and slightly shaky, but deliberate, each word placed with care. What Dalt had written was this. The county land office man had said something about a transfer of deed, and Roy Simmons had said something about original survey markers, and there had been a name, Price the assessor, and a date. 3 weeks from now. 3 weeks. Whatever Victor Halston was building toward legally, it was coming in 3 weeks. Caleb folded the paper back into his pocket and sat for a moment and let the shape of it settle. A transfer of deed. Original survey markers. The assessor already bought. 3 weeks. Victor was not bluffing, and he was not threatening, he was executing. He had already built the mechanism that was going to take the Bennett property, and it was already in motion, and all the nighttime surveyors and dead rabbits on porches were just pressure applied to make Martha and Rosalie afraid enough to accept whatever settlement he offered before the mechanism completed itself. He needed to know more about those survey markers. He was turning this over when the shadow fell across him. Mr. Rourke. He looked up. One of Victor's men from the saloon the night before. Not the larger of the two. The other one with a flat face and light eyes that communicated very little of what was behind them. Mr. Halston would like a word, the man said. Caleb considered this. Where, he said. His office, on the square. Now. If you don't mind. Caleb stood. I don't mind, he said. Because he didn't. He wanted to see Victor Halston in daylight in his own space without the theater of the saloon around them. He wanted to understand what this man was made of when he was not performing. Victor's office was on the second floor of the largest building on the town square, and the office itself told Caleb more in 30 seconds than an hour of questions would have. It was ordered with the precision of a man who controlled things and believed that the control of a desk was related to the control of everything else. The furniture was expensive. The windows were large. From where Victor sat behind his desk, he could see the entire main street of Willow Creek laid out below him like a map, like a possession. Mr. Rourke, Victor said. He was standing, not sitting, another choice deliberate. The standing man has the advantage of height and the option of movement. Caleb filed this. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the invitation, Caleb said pleasantly. Please sit. I'm fine standing. A brief pause. Victor absorbed this without visible reaction, which itself told Caleb something. This was a man who had learned to treat minor challenges to his comfort as information rather than insults. He was smarter than he had looked last night, or perhaps he had simply had more time to compose himself. I'll be direct, Victor said. Please. You are a man passing through Willow Creek who has, through an unlucky coincidence, inserted himself into a local matter that has no bearing on him personally. Victor moved to the window and looked down at the street below. I respect directness, so I'll tell you directly. The Bennett property matter is resolved. It may not appear resolved to the women involved, but from a legal standpoint, the outcome is not in question. Whatever you imagine you can offer them protection, advocacy, intervention, it will only prolong a distress that is unfortunately inevitable. And if I don't see it that way, Caleb asked, then you will waste time that could be better spent elsewhere. Victor turned from the window. I'm also prepared to be generous. You appear to be a man of capability without a current situation. I have ongoing needs for men of capability. The position pays well and comes with certain protections that a man riding alone does not enjoy. There it was, the offer. Made before the threat, which meant Victor still thought he could be bought. That was useful. It meant Victor had not yet decided he was a genuine obstacle, had not yet escalated to the response that would mean the conversation was over. That's a generous offer, Caleb said. I believe it is. I'll need to think on it. Victor studied him with those calm eyes. Of course, he said. Take a day. He paused. One day, Mr. Rourke. I find that men who need longer than a day to decide on the right side of a thing tend to end up on the wrong one. Caleb nodded and walked out. On the stairs coming up as he was going down, he passed a man he recognized from Dalt's description. Roy Simmons, Victor's legal runner, with a leather satchel under his arm, and the distracted, purposeful look of a man who was on an errand that mattered. Caleb moved to one side to let him pass. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. Roy Simmons looked away first. Caleb walked back to the Bennett property with his mind running hard. One day. He had one day before Victor stopped offering and started applying the other kind of pressure, and he still did not know enough. He needed to know what was in those survey records. He needed to know where the legal mechanism's weak point was. And he needed to do it without tipping his hand, because the moment Victor understood that Caleb was looking for legal leverage, rather than simply providing physical protection, the rules of this thing would change. I was halfway up the north road when Rosalie appeared coming the other way, at a pace that was almost a run. Rosalie. He caught her by the arms as she nearly collided with him. What happened? Someone came to the house, she said. She was breathing hard, not from running from control, from the effort of keeping herself together through something that wanted to come apart. A man from the county assessor's office. He left papers. What kind of papers? A notice of survey discrepancy. She pulled a folded document from her pocket and pushed it at him. He said there's a question about the original boundary markers on the east side of our property. He said there's going to be a reassessment. Caleb unfolded the paper and read it. His jaw tightened. When? He said, though he already knew. 3 weeks, Rosalie said. Mr. Rourke, if they reassess the boundary markers on the east side, we lose the creek access. Without the creek access, the property is worth almost nothing. Victor could come in with a lowball offer, and we'd have no choice but to take it or... She stopped. Her hands were shaking again. She pressed them together, the same gesture as last night outside the saloon, the same practiced discipline. Mama she's holding up. But she sat down at the kitchen table after that man left, and she sat there and didn't say anything for a long time, and she is not a woman who runs out of things to say. Caleb folded the paper and put it in his pocket beside Dalt's note. I need to ask you something, he said. And I need you to think carefully before you answer. All right. Your grandfather, your mother's father. You mentioned him. Your mother mentioned him last night in a way that... He stopped, chose his words. Tell me about him. Rosalie went still. Why? Because when I mentioned Victor coming after the property, your mother's eyes went to the Bible on the shelf before she could stop them. And because a woman like Martha Bennett doesn't look at a Bible the way other women do, she wasn't looking at it for comfort. She was looking at it like it was something specific. Rosalie stared at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the grass along the road, and a hawk turned overhead in a slow, patient circle. My grandfather was Hector Garfield, she said finally. He served in the cavalry for 22 years. He was in this territory before Willow Creek was. Willow Creek before Victor Halston was anything more than a clerk's son in a city somewhere. She paused. He was also the man who filed the original land surveys in this county, 20 years ago, before the county land office was established. Caleb felt something shift in his understanding. He filed them. He filed them. He walked this land himself. He placed the markers himself. He recorded everything himself in his own survey books. She met Caleb's eyes. And before he died 2 years ago, he told Mama to keep the Bible safe. He said she told me this exactly. He said, Martha, that book is the deed to more than you know. Don't let anyone take it, and don't tell anyone what's in it until you need to. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. And you think, he started. I think, Rosalie said, that my grandfather found out something about Victor Halston 20 years ago. I think he hid the evidence in the Bible. And I think Victor Halston knows it's there, or suspects it, and the survey discrepancy is not just about our land. It's about making sure we're too desperate and too scared to look too closely at what grandfather left behind. Caleb turned and started walking back toward the house. Where are you going? Rosalie called. To look at the Bible, he said. She caught up to him in 3 quick steps. You can't just Mama hasn't even... Has she looked at it? He didn't slow down. Since your grandfather died, has she opened it? Rosalie hesitated. No, she said. She said she wasn't ready. She may need to be ready now. They reached the house at a near run and came through the door, and Martha was exactly where Rosalie had described, sitting at the kitchen table, with her hands folded in front of her, and her face composed in that careful, deliberate way. She looked up when they came in. The papers, she said to Caleb. You've seen them. I've seen them. He sat down across from her. Mrs. Bennett, Martha, I need to ask you about your father. Something crossed her face. Grief and pride mixed together, the expression of a woman who loved someone she had lost and had not finished losing. What about him? The Bible on that shelf, Caleb said. What did he tell you about it? The silence lasted a long time. Then Martha stood and walked to the shelf and took the Bible down with both hands and set it on the table between them, and she sat back down and looked at it for a moment without touching it further. He told me the truth was in here, she said. He told me it would matter someday. He told me not to look until I needed to. She looked up at Caleb. Is this the day I need to? Yes, ma'am, Caleb said. I believe it is. Martha opened the Bible. The pages were dense with her father's handwriting. Not in the margins, not on the end papers, but on sheets of thin paper pressed between the pages. Throughout the book, dozens of them covered in the precise and meticulous script of a man who had spent his career recording the physical truth of the land. Survey notations, bearing measurements, reference points, dates going back 20 years, and between those in a different ink in a hand that grew more urgent as the pages progressed letters. Observations. The documented account of a cavalry veteran who had watched something happen in the land records of a young county and had understood what he was watching, and had been too smart to trust anyone with what he knew until he had put it somewhere safe. Rosalie leaned over the table and read a passage aloud, her voice low and careful. VH has obtained the secondary survey records and altered the eastern boundary notation on parcels 14 through 19. The original markers are where I placed them. The records at the county office no longer match the ground. I have measured. I have documented. The truth is on the land and in these pages and nowhere else. The kitchen went silent. VH, Caleb said. Victor Halston, Martha said. Her voice was perfectly flat, the voice of a woman who had just had a long suspicion confirmed and was processing what that meant. He altered the boundary records 20 years ago. And your father knew, Caleb said, and documented everything, and hid it, Rosalie said. She was still reading, turning pages slowly, her face changing as she moved through her grandfather's words. He hid it here because he was afraid. Look here. She pressed her finger to a page. He says he went to the sheriff at the time, and the sheriff told him to let it go. He says he went to the county judge, and the judge told him the same. He says... Her voice caught. She steadied it. He says that Victor Halston had already bought the law by then, and that the only safety for this knowledge was to keep it out of official hands until someone arrived who could use it in an official way. Someone from outside, Caleb said. Federal, Martha said. The word came out of her quietly, like she had been holding it for a long time. My father said once, just once, and I didn't understand what he meant. At the time he said that the truth he was keeping was federal jurisdiction if it ever got to the right ears. Land fraud on surveyed parcels, manipulation of official records. He said a federal land agent would move on it. That a local sheriff couldn't bury it if a federal man already had it. Caleb sat back in his chair. Victor Halston had been committing land fraud for 20 years. He had built his empire on falsified survey records. He had corrupted the sheriff and the assessor and whatever judge had been available. He had applied 20 years of patient systemic pressure on anyone who threatened to expose him or simply stood in his way. And an old cavalry veteran had sat quietly and documented every bit of it, and hidden the documentation in a family Bible, and trusted his daughter to keep it safe until the right moment. The right moment was apparently now. I need to get this to a federal land agent, Caleb said. How far to the nearest federal office? Millhaven, Rosalie said. 2 days' ride. That's a problem, Caleb said. We have 3 weeks before the reassessment and 2 days each way. But the bigger problem is... He looked at both of them. The moment I ride out of this county with that Bible, Victor Halston is going to know something is wrong. He has eyes on this property. He may have eyes on the road. Then I'll go, Rosalie said. No, Caleb said. Why not? He's less likely to. Because if he figures out what's in that Bible before we get it to someone who can act on it, he will do whatever it takes to stop it from arriving. And I am not going to put you on that road alone. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it that made Rosalie go still. I've seen what men like Victor Halston do when they're cornered. I've seen it up close. You are not riding to Millhaven alone. A silence fell over the kitchen. Then Martha reached across the table and put her hand over Rosalie's, and looked at Caleb with those clear, tired, indomitable eyes. "Then figure out a way," she said. "That's what my father would have said. Figure out a way or make one." Caleb looked at the Bible open on the table. He looked at the pages covered in a dead man's careful handwriting, the documentation of a wrong that had been buried for 20 years and was about to surface in 3 weeks, whether Victor Halston liked it or not. He looked at Martha's hand over Rosalie's. The hands of a woman who was staying and a woman who was deciding, and both of them looking at him across a kitchen table in a house that was not going to move. "All right," he said. "Here's what we're going to do." He talked for the next hour. He laid it out flat and plain, the legal timeline, what he knew, and what he still needed to find out the way Victor's mechanism worked and where its weaknesses were. He talked about the survey markers and what it would mean to walk the Bennett property with the original documentation and establish that the current official record did not match the ground. He talked about who in Willow Creek might be reached and who was too far gone into Victor's arrangements to be trusted. He talked about the church and the bell and the specific way small towns worked when a majority of their members finally understood they had been afraid of the same thing at the same time. Rosalie listened with both hands flat on the table, the same gesture as the saloon, the same stillness that was not passivity but concentration. When he finished, she asked 3 questions, precise and practical. The questions of someone who had been thinking about this problem for a long time and was now rapidly incorporating new information. Martha listened without interrupting, and at the end, she said only one thing. "My father would have liked you," she said to Caleb. "He had a gift for knowing which men were worth the trouble." Caleb did not say anything to that. He folded his hands around his empty coffee cup and looked out the kitchen window at the property that Thomas Bennett had built with $40 and determination, and he thought about what it meant to stand for something that was already in motion when you arrived to step into someone else's fight that was also unmistakably the right fight. He had spent 3 years being nobody's anything. He was not sure when exactly that had changed, but he was certain, sitting at that kitchen table, with the pages of an old man's documented courage spread open between them, that it had changed, and that he was glad in the specific and unfamiliar way of a man who has not felt glad about anything in a very long time, that it had changed here in this house with these 2 women who had refused to fold when every force around them was designed to make them fold. Outside, the wind moved through the yard, and somewhere down the north road in the fine office above the main street of Willow Creek, Victor Halston was waiting for Caleb Rourke's answer. He was going to get one, just not the one he was expecting. Caleb sent his answer to Victor Halston that same afternoon. Not in person, not in writing. He sent it the only way that mattered in a town like Willow Creek, through the deliberate visible act of walking back into the dusty Crown. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, sitting down at the bar, ordering coffee instead of whiskey, and staying there for 2 hours, while the room watched him and calculated what it meant. It meant no. Victor would understand that. Victor understood everything. Caleb spent those 2 hours doing what he did best, listening. Not to conversations directed at him, but to the ones happening around him, the way water moved around a stone in a creek, and what he gathered in those 2 hours rearranged several things he thought he knew about Willow Creek, and added several things he had not known at all. The first thing he learned was that Victor Halston had not always been what he was now. 15 years ago, when he first arrived in Willow Creek, he had been genuinely useful, a businessman with capital and vision, who built the mill and employed a third of the town's working men, and was by most accounts reasonable to deal with. The corruption had grown gradually, the way it always grew in men who started with power, and discovered that more power was available if they were willing to bend. By the time the town understood what he had become, he had already made himself indispensable enough that the cost of opposing him was higher than most people could pay. The second thing he learned was the name of the one man in Willow Creek who had tried. A rancher named Sam Ellery, 4 years ago. He had gone to the county judge with a complaint about his property line, a complaint that in retrospect had been pointing at the same falsified survey records that Hector Garfield had documented. The complaint had been dismissed. 2 months later, Sam Ellery's barn had burned. He had sold his property to Victor within the week and left the county. Caleb filed this information next to Dalt's paper and the pages of the Bible and kept building the picture. He was almost out the door when Hector appeared at his elbow. The bartender looked like a man who had not slept, which was fair given the previous evening. His eyes were red-rimmed, and his hands were doing that thing again, that particular stillness of a man controlling what they might do if released. "Mr. Rourke," Hector said very low, "I need to speak with you." Caleb looked at him for a moment. "Outside," he said. They stood in the alley beside the saloon, and Hector pulled his jacket tighter against the afternoon wind and looked at the ground and then with visible effort looked up. "Last night wasn't my idea," Hector said. "I know. I want you to understand that. I have my wife, we have 2 children, and Victor Halston controls whether this establishment stays open, and whether the supply wagon comes through, and whether—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "That is not an excuse. I know it is not an excuse. I am telling you so you understand what you're dealing with. Every man in this town who does what Victor asks does it, because the cost of not doing it is higher than they can pay." "I understand that," Caleb said. "Do you?" Hector looked at him, not skeptical, desperate in the way of a man who needs to believe something is true and isn't sure yet if it is. "Because I have a thing I know. A thing I've known for 2 years and never told anyone because there was no one to tell." He swallowed. "Roy Simmons came in last night after you left. He was talking to one of Victor's men, and I heard him say that the reassessment on the Bennett property is not about the boundary at all. It's a mechanism. Once they establish the survey discrepancy, officially, they file a supplemental claim that voids the original deed on the grounds of inaccurate survey at time of issuance. The whole deed, not just the boundary, the whole thing." Caleb went very still. "They're not going to adjust the boundary line," he said slowly. "They're going to void the deed entirely. And then the property reverts to unregistered land," Hector said. "And Victor's people file an immediate claim on unregistered land. It's done in a day, legal, clean. There's nothing to fight afterward because there's nothing to fight with." He looked sick. "I heard Roy Simmons laugh about it. He said by the time those women understand what happened, they'll already be off the property." Caleb turned and walked back toward the north road at a pace just under a run. He needed to reach Martha and Rosalie before someone reached them first. Because if Hector had overheard that conversation, there was a chance, a real and dangerous chance, that Victor knew Hector had overheard it, and Victor was not a man who left loose ends. He was 300 yards up the north road when he heard the horse behind him. He turned. Roy Simmons on a bay horse moving at a trot, not toward the Bennett property, toward the county road that ran east, toward the assessor's office in the next county, moving faster than he needed to for a routine errand. Caleb understood immediately. The timeline had moved. Something had shifted Victor's plan forward, and Roy Simmons was riding to accelerate the legal mechanism before whatever threat Caleb represented could be countered. He had less time than 3 weeks. He might have days. He ran the last quarter mile to the Bennett house. Rosalie met him at the gate, and she read his face before he said a word. "What happened?" He told her fast and without softening it. The voiding mechanism. Roy Simmons on the road east. The timeline collapsing. He watched her absorb it, and watched her make the same transition he had seen in the saloon. Fear arriving and being met and being turned into something functional. She was getting faster at it. Necessity was a brutal teacher. "Mama," she said, and turned toward the house. Martha heard it standing up. She did not sit down. She stood at the kitchen counter with her arms folded and her jaw set, and she listened to everything Caleb said, and when he finished, she said, "How long do we have?" "If Simmons files a motion to accelerate the reassessment, maybe a week, maybe less." "Then we move tonight," Martha said. "Martha." "Tonight, Mr. Rourke?" Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "My father spent 20 years protecting that evidence because he believed that one day there would be a moment when it could actually be used. If that moment is now, then we move now. We don't wait, and we don't hesitate, and we don't give Victor Halston 1 more hour than we have to." Caleb looked at her. He looked at Rosalie. Rosalie was already moving toward the shelf where the Bible sat. The plan they had laid out that morning was still the core of it. Get the documentation to a federal land agent in Millhaven. But the original version of the plan had involved time that no longer existed. The new version required something harder. They needed to move the Bible's contents tonight, and they needed to do it without Victor's watchers on the property seeing what was being moved. "He'll have someone on the road," Caleb said. "Especially after today. He knows I refused his offer, and he knows I'm not leaving. He'll want to know what I'm doing." "Then we give them something to watch," Rosalie said. Caleb looked at her. She was standing with the Bible in her hands, and her chin level, and the specific light in her eyes of someone who has been playing defense for so long that the shift to offense feels like finally breathing correctly. "You ride out the South Road after dark," she said. "Visible. Make noise about it. Let them see you go." "And the Bible goes with me," she said. "On the North Trail, through the ridge. It's longer, but it doesn't pass through town, and Victor's men don't bother with it because it's rough ground and anyone who uses it knows it." She paused. "My grandfather showed it to me. I've ridden it 100 times." "Alone," Caleb said. "I am not helpless, Mr. Rourke. I know you're not helpless. I also know that Victor Halston shot at your dog and poisoned drinks and burned a man's barn. Alone is not the issue. The issue is what happens if they figure out the diversion before you clear the ridge." Rosalie looked at him steadily. "Then you'd better make a convincing enough diversion that they don't." I wanted to argue with this. Every instinct he had said that putting Rosalie on a dark trail with 20 years of incriminating documentation and a 2-day ride ahead of her was a bad idea. But his instincts were also telling him something else, that this woman had been navigating danger on her own long before he arrived, and that the particular look she was wearing right now was not the look of someone asking permission. "All right," he said. "But your mother goes with you." Martha opened her mouth. "Non-negotiable," Caleb said, and something in his voice apparently communicated that he meant it, because Martha closed her mouth and looked at him for a long moment, and then gave a single small nod. They spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. Caleb went back into town, deliberately visibly letting himself be seen, and bought supplies at the general store with the unhurried manner of a man settling in for a longer stay. He stopped and talked to Dalt. He sat on the bench outside the feed store and watched the street. He wanted Victor's people to see a man who was digging in, not a man whose people were packing to ride. When he came back to the property at dusk, Rosalie had the Bible wrapped in oilcloth and packed in a saddlebag, with everything else she and Martha would need for 2 days on the trail. She had saddled 2 horses, the mare and a sturdy gray that had been Thomas Bennett's horse and still moved like it remembered being well trained. "The federal land agent's name is Cooper," Caleb said. "Franklin Cooper. He's been in the Millhaven office 6 years. I know his name from a man I used to ride with who dealt with him on a claim dispute. He's honest, which in federal land office terms means he's unusual. Federal survey matter. Do not explain it to the clerk. Do not tell them what's in it. Just get it in federal hands." He met her eyes. "The moment it's in a federal office, it becomes a federal record. Victor can't touch it there." Rosalie nodded. She had her hair pinned back and her traveling coat buttoned, and she looked in the gray last light of the day, like the person she was when nobody was underestimating her, capable and purposeful and exactly as serious as the situation required. "And you," she said. "I'm going to stay visible," Caleb said. "And I'm going to find out what else Victor is planning, because whatever this legal mechanism is, it has other pieces. It always has other pieces." She looked at him for a moment. Something moved across her face that she did not say. "Be careful," she said instead. "You too, Miss Bennett." "Rosalie," she said quietly, "I think you've earned that by now." He watched them go at full dark North Trail, no lantern. He stood at the gate and listened to the hoofbeats fade into the ridge, and then he walked back down the South Road into Willow Creek, with his coat open and his stride unhurried, and his mind running 3 steps ahead of every possible response Victor Halston might make. He made it as far as the edge of town before one of Victor's men fell into step beside him. "Mr. Halston would like his answer," the man said. "He has it," Caleb said. The man matched his pace without effort. He was large, wide through the shoulders, with the flat economy of movement of someone who had spent years doing physical work that occasionally required hurting people. Mr. Halston thinks you might want to reconsider. Mr. Halston can think whatever he likes. That's not a smart attitude. Probably not. Caleb agreed pleasantly. The man put a hand on Caleb's arm. Not grabbing yet, just the weight of it, the suggestion of what the hand could become if the conversation went a certain direction. Caleb stopped walking and looked down at the hand and then up at the man, and whatever the man saw in his face in that moment made him lift the hand back. "Tell your employer," Caleb said, "that I'll come see him tomorrow morning. We can discuss his offer at length." He walked the rest of the way into town alone. He needed tomorrow morning because he needed tonight, needed Victor's attention on him here in town, while Martha and Rosalie put miles between themselves and Willow Creek. Every hour he could keep Victor's focus pointed at Caleb Rourke was an hour that the two women on the North Trail were closer to Millhaven. I went to the Dusty Crown and sat at the bar and did not drink and was seen not drinking, and around 10 o'clock he went to the loft above the Bennett barn and lay down and stared at the dark and ran through everything he knew. He was deep in this process when Chester made a sound, not a bark. Chester did not bark anymore, had not had the hearing for it in years. It was a low sound in the dog's chest, felt more than heard the vibration of an old animal registering something that bypassed his ears and landed somewhere more ancient. Caleb was on his feet before he was consciously aware of having decided to move. He went to the loft window and looked out and saw them. Not two this time. 4. Coming through the yard from two directions simultaneously, which meant they had come around from both sides of the property, which meant this was not a survey or a warning. This was an entry. They were going to the house. Caleb dropped from the loft in one movement and hit the ground running. He came around the corner of this barn and put himself between the men and the house door, and he did it fast enough that the nearest man was only 10 feet away when Caleb stopped moving. "House is empty," Caleb said. His voice carried no particular emotion. "You've had a long walk for nothing." The man stopped. Behind him, the other three adjusted their positions, not coming closer, reading the situation. Caleb counted the spacing, the angles. He had his revolver at his hip, but he did not reach for it. Not yet. "That true," the man said. He was looking past Caleb at the dark house doing his own reading. "Go check if you want," Caleb said. "You'll find I don't lie about things that can be verified." A pause. The man was calculating. Victor had sent them for something specific, and if the specific thing was not here, going through Caleb to search an empty house was a cost-benefit problem that came out wrong. "Where are they?" the man said. "I don't know," Caleb said. "You're lying." "Verify it," Caleb said again. "Take your men and check the house and the barn and the road. I'll wait." Another pause. Longer. Then the man made a sound in his throat and looked at the two men behind him and jerked his head, and they moved to the house and checked it, and when they came back, their faces confirmed what Caleb had said. "Victor's not going to like this," the man said. "I expect not," Caleb said. The four of them left. Caleb stood in the dark yard and listened to them go, and then he went to Chester, who was standing at the barn door with that low vibration still moving through his old chest, and he put a hand on the dog's gray head. "Good boy," he said quietly. "You did your job." Chester's tail moved once. It was enough. Caleb did not sleep again that night. I was at the gate when dawn came, and he was watching the north road when the rider arrived at mid-morning, and his hand went to his revolver before he recognized the horse. Not one of Victor's men. One of the men from the far end of the ridge, a farmer named Teague, who had looked away when Caleb passed him on the road 2 days ago, and now came toward the gate with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man arriving somewhere he had spent a long time deciding to arrive. "Mr. Rourke," Teague said. He stopped his horse at the gate and looked at Caleb steadily. "I heard about the papers the county sent, the reassessment." "News travels," Caleb said. "In this town it does." Teague turned his hat in his hands, a nervous gesture, but his voice was not nervous. It was the voice of a man who had made his decision and arrived on the other side of it. "I got the same papers 4 years ago, about my east boundary. I thought it was a mistake, and I tried to fight it, And Victor's man Roy Simmons explained to me very clearly that it would be better if I didn't. His jaw tightened. I didn't. And I've spent 4 years wishing I had. What happened to your boundary? Caleb said. Shifted. 60 feet. I lost access to the south irrigation channel, and my yield dropped by 1/3. He looked directly at Caleb. Same mechanism they're using on the Bennetts. I understand that now. I didn't understand it then. I'm here because if there's something that can be done, and I didn't come say what I know then, I'm the same as the ones who stood by while this happened to Thomas Bennett's family. Caleb opened the gate. Come in, he said. Tell me everything. Teague told him everything, and by the time he finished, 2 other men had arrived at the gate, both of them with versions of the same story. Different properties, different years, same mechanism. Victor had been running this same play for a decade, shifting boundaries, voiding claims, absorbing land, and every man who had been through it had stayed silent because the silence felt safer. Until now. Caleb looked at the 3 men in front of him and felt the shape of something shifting the specific moment in a long siege, when the people inside the walls stop waiting for rescue and start thinking about the gate. How many more? He asked. How many in this county got those papers from Price's office? The 3 men exchanged looks. 7 that I know of for certain, Teague said. Probably more. I need you to find them, Caleb said. Today. I need every man who got those papers to know that there is documentation, federal quality documentation, that proves what was done to them. I need them to be ready to stand up together when the moment comes. Stand up how? One of the other men said. In public, Caleb said. In front of the whole town, all at once. Victor Halston's power depends on everyone believing they're alone. The moment they see each other standing together, that's over. A silence. Then Teague put his hat back on his head and nodded once. I'll ride, he said. So will I, said the second man. The third said nothing, just turned his horse and started down the road. Caleb watched them go, and then he turned and looked toward the North Ridge and thought about 2 women on a rough trail carrying 20 years of documented truth toward a federal office 2 days away. And he thought about 3 men riding in 3 directions to find 7 more who had been hurt by the same hand and told to be silent about it. He thought about Hector in the alley shaking, telling the truth, because the weight of it had finally become more than the weight of the consequence. I thought about old Dalt and his tin of nails and his piece of paper and his statement that he was too old to pretend he didn't know which way was right. Victor Halston had built his empire on the assumption that individual fear was permanent, that a man frightened enough would stay frightened, that a family pressured long enough would eventually give. He had never accounted for the particular stubbornness of a woman who met his men on her porch with her dead husband's rifle. He had never accounted for the fact that her father had spent 20 years being patient. And he had never not once accounted for the specific consequence of poisoning the wrong man's drink in a saloon on a Tuesday night, the consequence of a woman with dark hair and kind eyes, and more courage than anyone in that room had given her credit for opening her mouth and saying the 3 words that started all of this. Caleb went back to the house and sat at the kitchen table with the coffee Martha had left on the stove before she rode, still faintly warm, and he looked at the empty shelf where the Bible had been, and he thought about all the ways this could still go wrong. Roy Simmons, reaching the county office before Rosalie reached Mill Haven. Victor moving on the property before the federal documentation was officially received. The men Teague was riding to find, deciding when it came to the moment that standing up was still too expensive. The church bell sitting silent in its tower on the north side of town, waiting for someone to pull the rope. Caleb drank the cold coffee and thought and planned, and outside the wind was picking up from the north, moving fast and hard, the way it did when something was coming, and in the particular quiet of the empty Bennett house, he let himself understand fully, and without flinching, that the next 2 days were going to determine everything. He was ready for that. What he was not entirely ready for, what arrived quietly and without announcement. The way the most significant things tended to arrive was the realization that his readiness was not only about justice anymore. It was not only about debt repaid or wrong made right, or even about the fundamental human indecency of what Victor Halston had done to an entire county of working people. It was about the woman on the North Trail. The woman who had screamed across a crowded room when every reasonable instinct said, "Be silent." The woman who pressed her shaking hands together and made them still and looked at danger straight on and calculated the odds and said yes anyway. He was not ready to name what that was, but he was not running from it either, and that for Caleb Rourke was entirely new. The second day without word from Rosalie was the hardest. Caleb kept himself busy because the alternative was standing at the gate, watching the north road, and that was not useful. He split wood that did not need splitting. He checked the fencing along the creek bank and repaired 2 posts that were soft at the base. He talked to every man Teague had brought back to him, and Teague had been productive riding hard through the previous day and returning before nightfall with 6 more men, all of them carrying versions of the same story. All of them wearing the particular expression of people who have been holding something painful in private for a long time and have finally been given permission to set it down. 7 men, 7 properties, 7 separate incidents of survey discrepancy, boundary adjustment, deed pressure, all of them traceable. Caleb now understood to the same source. Roy Simmons filing paperwork at the county office. Gideon Price signing off as assessor. Victor Halston's name appearing nowhere in the official record, because Victor was too careful for that, too patient, too practiced in the art of building mechanisms that operated without his fingerprints on them. The mechanism was the point. That was what made it so hard to fight. Victor had constructed a legal process that looked legitimate from the outside and was rotten at its core, and the rottenness lived in documents that had been filed and stamped and officially recorded. And the only thing that could counter official records was more official records, which was precisely what Rosalie and Martha were carrying to Millhaven on a rough trail through the ridge. If they made it. Caleb drove a fence post into the cold ground with more force than it needed, and told himself to stop thinking about if. "Mr. Rourke." Teague's voice came from behind him. "Victor's man was in town this morning, asking questions about the women, where they'd gone, when they'd be back." Caleb kept working. What did people tell him? Nothing worth having, Teague said. There was something new in his voice, a quality that had not been there 2 days ago. Steadier. More settled. The quality of a man who has chosen a side and discovered that the choosing itself was a relief. Dalt told him Martha had gone to visit her sister in Colebrook. 3 other people confirmed it independently without being asked. He paused. "This town is not entirely lost, Mr. Rourke." "No," Caleb said. "It's not." He drove the post flush and stood up straight. "Victor's going to move soon. He sent those men to the property 2 nights ago and found it empty, and now he's asking questions about the women. He's adding it up." "What does he add up to?" "That something's in motion he didn't authorize," Caleb said. "And he doesn't know what it is, which means he'll move to control the thing he can control. The legal timeline." He looked at Teague directly. He's going to try to accelerate the reassessment further. Move it from a week to days. Maybe file an emergency motion. Teague absorbed this. Can he do that? With Price in his pocket and Simmons doing the filing? Yes. Caleb pulled off his work gloves. Which means I need to move today, not tomorrow, today. What do you need? I need every one of those 7 men at the church at noon, Caleb said. And I need someone to send word to Hector. Teague raised an eyebrow. The bartender. He overheard Simmons laying out the voiding mechanism, Caleb said. He's a witness to a conversation that happened between Victor's legal man and one of his associates. That's not nothing. That might be enough to establish intent if a federal man is asking the right questions. He put the gloves in his back pocket. Hector's scared. He's going to need someone to tell him that scared is not the same as trapped. Teague nodded slowly. I'll send word. Caleb went to the church. He had been in 100 churches like this one, white-painted, plain-windowed, built by people who needed a place to put the part of themselves that the land kept trying to crush. The minister was a soft-spoken man named Aldridge, who had the particular quality of clergy who have spent years watching their congregation navigate impossible situations and have learned that the most useful thing they can offer is not answers, but presence. He listened to Caleb for 15 minutes without interrupting, and when Caleb finished, he was quiet for a moment, Victor Halston has been a major contributor to this church's roof fund, Aldridge said carefully. I know, Caleb said. That is not, Aldridge continued, a statement of loyalty. It is a statement of the complexity of this situation. He looked at Caleb steadily. What do you need from me? I need the use of this building, Caleb said. And I need you to be here when it happens, because when this town sees its minister standing in front of its church with these men, it changes what this looks like. It makes it a community event instead of a dispute. Aldridge thought about this for a long moment. Then he stood. The door is always open, he said. I believe that fairly comprehensively. By noon 9, men were assembled inside the church, including Hector, who came in last and sat in the back pew with his hat in his hands, and the look of a man who has done something that cannot be undone, and is still deciding if he is glad of it. Teague sat in the front. The other 7 ranged between them in various postures of discomfort and determination. Caleb stood at the front and looked at them, and understood with the specific clarity of a man who has seen enough moments to recognize the kind that matters that this was one. I'm going to tell you what I know, he said. And then I'm going to tell you what I think we can do about it. And then every man here is going to make his own decision, and I'll respect whatever that decision is. This is not a situation where I'm asking anyone to do something they can't afford. He told them everything. Victor's mechanism. The survey falsification going back 20 years. Hector's witnessed conversation. The documentation that was, God willing, currently sitting in a federal land office 2 counties away. He laid it out plain and factual and without drama, because these were men who had been dealing with the dramatic version of this story for years, and what they needed now was the plain version. When he finished, the church was quiet. Then the man on the far left, a rancher named Birch, the one who had not spoken since arriving, said quietly, He shifted my boundary line 3 years ago. I lost 40 acres. I thought I had no recourse. You may have recourse now, Caleb said, if the federal documentation holds. And if it doesn't, Caleb looked at him steadily. Then you're in the same position you're in right now. You have nothing to lose by standing up. Another silence. Then Hector raised his head from the back pew. I'll testify, he said. His voice cracked on the word, and he steadied it. To what I heard, whatever that costs me. Something shifted in the room. Not dramatic, the room was too full of exhausted, frightened men for drama. But real. The specific shift of air in a space where people have been individually afraid, and have suddenly, without planning it, become collectively something else. Caleb was about to speak again when the church door opened. Every head turned. It was not one of Victor's men. It was a woman from the far end of town, a widow named Clara Perch, who had never spoken to Caleb and had no connection to any of the properties being discussed. She stood in the doorway with her hands folded and looked at the assembled men with an expression that was equal parts embarrassed and resolved. I heard there was a meeting, she said. There is, Caleb said. I have something to say, Clara Perch said. About my husband. About what happened to his claim on the North Range before he died. She came in and sat down in the nearest pew and folded her hands again. I've been waiting for someone to ask. Nobody ever asked. 3 minutes later, another woman came in. Then a man Caleb had not met. Then 2 more. By the time the meeting had been going for an hour, there were 19 people in the church, and Caleb was no longer doing most of the talking. He stepped back and let it happen, and watched Victor Halston's careful architecture of individual silence dismantle itself in real time, one voice at a time, each story connecting to the next. The way creek water found its level, naturally, inevitably, as if it had always been moving toward this moment and had simply needed a channel. He was watching Clara Perch describe the specific conversation she'd had with Roy Simmons 4 years ago when his attention snagged on the window. Victor's man, the wide-shouldered one from the night outside the property, standing across the street, not moving, watching the church. Caleb made himself stay still. The man was not coming in, he was reporting. He would go back to Victor with the information that there were 19 people in that church, and Caleb Rourke was standing at the front, and Victor would have perhaps an hour to decide what to do about it before whatever this meeting became something he could not control. That hour mattered. Caleb waited until Clara Perch finished speaking, and then he leaned to Teague and said quietly, "Get word to everyone here. They need to be ready for tonight. Whatever I send as a signal, they come. Fast." "What signal?" Teague said. Caleb looked up at the church bell in its tower. Teague followed his gaze and understood and nodded once. Caleb left the church by the side door and walked to Victor Halston's building on the square and went up the stairs without being invited and walked into the office without knocking. Victor was at his desk. Roy Simmons was standing beside it. Both of them looked up, and neither of them looked surprised, which told Caleb they had already received their report. "Mr. Rourke," Victor said. The calm was still there. The absolute infuriating calm of a man who believed he had accounted for everything. "You've been busy." "I have," Caleb said. He sat down across the desk without being offered the chair. "I want to talk to you directly, man to man, before this gets to a place neither of us can walk back from." "I appreciate that impulse," Victor said. "The documentation your survey plan is designed to counter," Caleb said, "is no longer on the Bennett property." A pause. Very small. But Caleb caught at the first hairline crack in the composure. Victor's eyes moved to Simmons and back. "I don't know what documentation you're referring to." "Yes, you do," Caleb said. "You've known about it since Hector Garfield filed the original surveys 20 years ago. You've known it existed somewhere in that family because you couldn't find it, and you couldn't make them sell, and you couldn't explain where your boundary numbers came from if someone looked at the original markers." He leaned forward. "It's in federal hands now, or it will be by tomorrow morning." The silence in the office was the specific silence of something very large shifting its weight. Simmons made a small movement toward the door. Caleb looked at him. "I wouldn't," Caleb said. "Wherever you're thinking of riding, it's already too late to get there first." Simmons stopped. Victor sat very still behind his desk. The calm was still on his face, but it had changed quality. It was no longer the calm of control. It was the calm of a man running calculations at speed, assessing damage, looking for angles. Caleb had seen that specific transition before, and he knew what it meant. The offer phase was over, and the threat phase had not yet begun, and in the space between them, there was a window that lasted approximately as long as Victor's calculations were still running. "What do you want?" Victor said. "I want you to understand something," Caleb said. "Whatever you're calculating right now, whatever your next move is, there are 19 people in the church across the street who have all given me their testimony. Dates, amounts, conversations, property descriptions. 19, Victor. That's not a dispute. That's a pattern. And patterns are exactly what federal investigators are trained to recognize." Victor's jaw tightened. The first physical tell. "And if I call the sheriff right now," Victor said. "Your sheriff," Caleb said. "The one you've had in your arrangement for how long? 8 years, 10. He kept his voice even. "Call him. It'll be the last official act he performs in this county because the moment a federal investigation opens on the land records, every arrangement he's part of comes out with it." Another silence. Longer. "You have no idea," Victor said quietly, "what you have set in motion." "I have a pretty good idea," Caleb said. "And I think you do too." He stood. "I'm going to give you tonight to make a decision. One night. Tomorrow morning, whatever those documents say, when they're read by a federal land agent, is going to determine the rest of this." He looked at Victor across the desk at the silver hair, and the fine suit, and the 20 years of patient systemic wrong, built on the falsified work of a meticulous old soldier. "The decision you have to make is whether you add obstruction to what they already have, or whether you stop where you are." Victor said nothing. Caleb left. He was on the stairs when he heard Victor's voice very low to Simmons. He could not make out the words, but the tone was the tone of instructions, and they were being given fast. He moved. He went out through the building's back door and cut across the alley and came back around to where he could see the building's front without being visible himself. And 40 seconds later, Roy Simmons came out the front at nearly a run, heading not toward the county road, but toward the south end of town, toward the processing site, toward the men Victor kept on his construction payroll who were not there to build things. The calculation was over. Victor had landed on the threat phase. Caleb ran for the church. The people were still there. The meeting had continued without him, had in fact expanded, voices overlapping with the slightly chaotic energy of a group of people discovering simultaneously that they have more to say than they realized. Caleb came through the side door, and the room went quiet, and he looked at Teague. "Now," he said. Teague stood up. The bell rope hung beside the vestibule, heavy braided hemp, worn smooth at the grip. Teague took it in both hands and pulled. The sound of the church bell over Willow Creek on that afternoon was not subtle. It was not meant to be. It rang once, and then again, and then settled into a steady, deliberate rhythm that carried through the town and up the North Road and into the houses and the shops and the places where people had been keeping their heads down for years and telling themselves it was the smart thing to do. Caleb stood outside the church doors and watched Willow Creek come out. Not everyone. Not at first. But they came in ones and twos then, in groups drawn by the sound and by something older than the sound. The specific human response to a bell rung in the middle of an ordinary afternoon that says something is happening and you need to see it. Victor's men came from the south end of town on horseback. 6 of them moving fast with Simmons at the front, and the specific purposefulness of a group that has been told to stop something and understands there is a short window in which stopping is still possible. They pulled up when they saw the crowd, because the crowd had become in the 12 minutes since the bell began ringing, something that could not be simply ridden through. It was not large 40 people, maybe 50, but it was the specific composition that mattered. It was women and men and people who had been in Willow Creek for decades, standing on the street outside their church, and their minister was on the steps beside a man they did not know well, but had watched over 4 days make choices that cost him something. And that combination, the church, the minister, the cost, meant that riding through it would look like exactly what it was. Simmons understood this. He pulled his horse to a stop, and the men behind him stopped, and they sat there on their horses looking at the crowd, and the crowd looked back. Victor's sheriff appeared from the far end of the street moving on foot, and he stopped too when he saw the size of it. Caleb stepped forward. "My name is Caleb Rourke," he said. His voice carried in the street quiet. "I'm not from this town, and I don't have a stake in its arrangements. But I've spent 4 days listening to what those arrangements have cost people who live here, and I think this town deserves to hear it said out loud." He talked for 10 minutes. He did not shout. He did not accuse with heat. He laid out the way he had laid it out in the church, plain and factual and without drama, and he named things that had been carefully left unnamed for years, and beside him he felt the 19 people from the church moving forward to stand with him, and behind them he felt the town adjusting its weight. He was halfway through when Simmons made his decision. "This man is a drifter with no standing in this county," Simmons called out. "He is interfering in a legal process, and everything he's saying is, he's right." The voice that cut through Simmons came from Hector, standing at the front of the crowd with his hands in fists at his sides, and his face the color of a man who has decided that being afraid is no longer the worst option available. "I heard you, Roy, 2 weeks ago in the saloon. I heard you tell Carter exactly how the voiding mechanism works. I heard the whole thing." Simmons went white. "I'll testify to it," Hector said. "Under oath. To a federal man, whatever that costs me." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when the air goes out of a room that doesn't have walls. Teague spoke next. Then Birch. Then Clara Perch. Not speeches, 3 sentences each, 4 at most. Just the plain factual naming of what had been done to them. One after another, the way the meeting in the church had worked, each voice making the next one possible. Simmons sat on his horse, and his expression moved through several things and landed on something Caleb recognized, the specific look of a man calculating whether the situation he is in is still recoverable, or whether his most urgent priority has shifted from executing Victor's instructions to protecting himself from their consequences. The sheriff, who had been standing at the far end of the street, turned around and walked back the way he had come. Quickly, without a word to anyone. Simmons watched him go. Then Simmons looked at his men and looked at the crowd and looked at Caleb and made the calculation that a man in his position ultimately had to make Victor Halston's protection was worth exactly as much as Victor Halston's ability to protect him, and that ability had just changed in a measurable way. He pulled his horse around and rode back toward the south end of town. His men, after a moment of confusion, followed. The crowd stood in the street and watched them go. Then someone. Caleb never saw who started to say something, and someone else responded, and the controlled silence of 40 people who had been individually afraid cracked open into the complicated, overlapping, imperfect noise of 40 people who had just stopped being afraid at the same time. Caleb stepped back from it. He let it happen. It did not need him anymore. He stood at the edge of the crowd, and he felt something move through him that he had not felt in a long time. Not relief exactly, and not satisfaction, though both of those were present. Something quieter than either. Something that had to do with standing in a specific place at a specific moment, and understanding that the place and the moment had needed him, and that he had been there. He was still standing at the edge of the crowd when he heard it. Hoofbeats. From the north. He turned. 2 horses on the north road coming down from the ridge at a steady pace, and even at that distance he knew the gray. Thomas Bennett's horse still moving, like it remembered being well trained, and he knew the rider. Rosalie. And beside her, sitting straight in the saddle, with the particular exhausted dignity of a woman who has ridden 2 hard days and is not going to let that show Martha. They came through the edge of town, and the crowd saw them, and something happened in the crowd that Caleb had not anticipated. A woman called out Rosalie's name, and someone else said, Martha, and the people parted to let them through with the specific warmth of a town that has just in the last half hour begun to remember itself. Rosalie pulled her horse up in front of Caleb. She looked at the crowd, and the church, and the street, and then she looked at him, and her face did the thing. It had done briefly in the dark outside the saloon, the near smile that changed everything about it. It's done, she said. Cooper received it this morning. He read the first 12 pages while we were still sitting in his office, and he sent a rider to the federal district before we left. She reached into her saddlebag and produced a folded document with a federal office seal. He gave us a receipt, official acknowledgement that the documentation is in federal custody and under active review. Caleb took the document. He looked at the seal. He looked up at Rosalie. Your grandfather, he said. Her eyes went bright. She pressed her lips together and controlled it. He was right, she said. He said one day it would matter. He was right. He was, Caleb said. Martha dismounted, and someone from the crowd. Clara Perch, who had come forward without being asked, took her horse, and Martha stood in the street and looked at the people around her with the expression of a woman who has been holding something up for a very long time and has just felt someone else put their hands under it. Thank you, she said to the crowd. Not loudly. She did not need to be loud. Thank you for standing. The crowd heard her. And the crowd, which had been a collection of individuals afraid of the same thing for years, became for that moment something more than that. Victor Halston did not appear on the street that afternoon. His lights were visible in the office above the square, the shadow of a man moving back and forth behind the glass, but he did not come out, and no more of his men came from the south end of town. Caleb stayed on the street until the crowd dispersed naturally, the way good things dispersed, slowly, reluctantly. People finding reasons to linger a little longer. He talked to Teague and to Hector and to Birch and to Clara Perch, and he made sure each of them understood what came next. The federal investigation would move, but it would take time. Victor still had resources, and he was still dangerous, and the battle was not over because a crowd had stood in the street. But the battle had changed. The architecture of individual fear had cracked in a way it could not be rebuilt. Once people know they are not alone in what they're afraid of, the alone is gone, and without it, the fear loses most of its leverage. Victor's mechanism had run on the assumption that each person was too scared to look to the left and see someone else as scared as themselves. That assumption was now broken in 40 places. It was late, the light going orange and flat across the rooftops, when Caleb finally turned toward the north road. Rosalie was at the gate of the Bennett property waiting. She had taken the horses to the barn and come back out, and she was standing with her arms folded against the evening cold, and when he came through the gate, she looked at him for a long moment without speaking. You rang the bell, she said. Teague rang it. Because you asked him to. Because the moment called for it. She looked at the street at the last few people still making their way home at the church, standing solid and white in the fading light. "I saw it from the ridge," she said quietly. "On the way down. I could hear it, and then I could see the people coming out, and I thought—" She stopped. "What?" Caleb said. "I thought my grandfather would have been glad." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright. "He spent 20 years waiting for that sound, for the town to stop being quiet." She looked at Caleb. "You gave them that." "They gave themselves that," Caleb said. "I just made it possible to happen all at once instead of one scared person at a time." Rosalie was quiet for a moment. The wind moved her hair where it had come loose from its pins after 2 days on the trail, and she pushed it back with one hand, with the practical, unself-conscious gesture of a woman focused on something more important than how she looks. "Why did you stay?" she said. The question landed simply without weight or manipulation. She was asking because she wanted to know. That was the kind of person she was, direct underneath all the caution. She asked what she meant. Caleb thought about all the answers to that question. The debt he'd felt from the first night. The plain wrongness of what was being done to her family. The larger wrong of what was being done to the county. All of those were true. Because it was the right place to be, he said. And because leaving would have been, I had been leaving for a long time. It was getting to be a hard habit to justify. She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "Come have supper. Mama will make something substantial. She always cooks when she's relieved. It's her version of celebration." He followed her toward the house and the lamp burning in the window, and behind them, the last of the light went off the rooftops and somewhere down the south end of town. Victor Halston was in his office, running calculations that were coming up wrong, no matter how many times he ran them, and somewhere in a federal office in Mill Haven, a land agent named Cooper was reading 20 years of a dead man's careful documentation and understanding what he was looking at. And in the Bennett house, Martha was already at the stove making something that smelled like the specific comfort of a woman who knows how to feed people through hard times and has decided that tonight is a night for it. Caleb hung his hat on the hook beside the door that Thomas Bennett had built, and Chester came and put his gray muzzle against Caleb's hand, and Martha said, "Sit down, Mr. Rourke," without turning from the stove, and Rosalie sat across from him at the scrub table and looked at him with her dark eyes and the near smile that he had decided was one of the most honest things he had ever seen on a person's face. He sat down. For the first time in 3 years, he sat down at a table that felt like it was the right table, and he did not think about the road. Martha's cooking that night was the kind that meant something. Not because it was elaborate, it wasn't. Beans and cornbread and a cut of salt pork that she stretched across 3 portions with the practiced economy of a woman who had learned to make enough feel like plenty. But she moved through this kitchen with a particular deliberateness, setting each thing on the table with the specific care of someone who understands that ordinary acts performed after extraordinary days carry a weight that ordinary days don't give them. Every plate placed was a statement. We are still here. This table is still ours. We are eating on it tonight, and we will eat on it tomorrow. Caleb ate and said very little, and listened to Martha and Rosalie talk, not about Victor, not about the federal documentation, not about what came next. They talked about Rosalie's grandfather, about the way he used to mark his survey maps in red ink, and how Rosalie as a child had believed the red lines were rivers. About the time he had walked the entire eastern boundary of the county on foot over 3 days, to verify a discrepancy in an old record, and how he had come home with his boots destroyed, and a look of absolute satisfaction that Martha said was the happiest she had ever seen him. He knew, Martha said quietly, setting her fork down. He knew what Victor was doing, and he knew he couldn't stop it the way he wanted to stop it, directly, openly, the way an honest man wants to stop a dishonest one. So he did the only thing he could. He documented. He waited. He trusted that the truth was patient enough to outlast the lie. "It was," Rosalie said. "It was." Martha agreed. She looked at Caleb. "Because of you. Because of your father," Caleb said. "I just moved things that were already in place." Martha shook her head slightly, not disagreeing, just refusing the deflection. "My father put the pieces on the board," she said. "But pieces on a board don't move themselves. Someone has to be willing to play. Caleb did not have an answer to that. He picked up his coffee cup and held it, and looked at the grain of the table, and thought about pieces on a board, and the specific quality of a man who had spent 3 years refusing to play anything at all. After supper, Rosalie walked out to the barn to check the horses, and Caleb followed, not because he was asked, but because the evening had settled into the particular quiet that follows days of sustained tension, the quiet that makes it possible to say things that the noise had been covering. She was checking the roan's right foreleg. The mare had favored it slightly on the downhill from the ridge, and she did not look up when he came in. "She's fine," Rosalie said. "Just tired." "Aren't we all?" Caleb said. She almost smiled. Chester was somewhere in the back of the barn, breathing in his slow, patient way, and the lamp Rosalie had hung threw warm light across the stalls and made everything look steadier than the day had been. Cooper said 2 to 3 weeks for the formal investigation to open. Rosalie said, still working the leg. He said once it opens, the reassessment order gets suspended automatically. He said, she paused. He said the documentation is some of the most thorough he's seen. He said whoever compiled it knew exactly what a federal land examiner would need and provided it. Your grandfather served with the Land Survey Corps for 8 years, Caleb said. He knew precisely what a federal land examiner would need because he had been one. Rosalie stood up and turned to face him, and the lamplight caught her face directly, and he saw what the last 4 days had put there. The exhaustion, the relief, and underneath both of those, something that had not been visible before. Something that had been behind the caution and the steadiness and the practiced discipline. Something that was showing now because the emergency had passed and the armor had come down just slightly, just enough. She was looking at him the way a person looks at something they have been afraid to look at directly. "What happens to you now?" she said. The question arrived quietly, but it landed with weight. Caleb had been not thinking about this question for approximately 18 hours, with the focused discipline of a man who understands that some calculations are better deferred until the immediate crisis is resolved. The crisis was resolved. The deferral was over. "I don't know," he said honestly. "You said you were passing through." "I said that, yes." "Do you still mean it?" He looked at her across the barn aisle, at the dark eyes that had been direct since the first moment he saw them, at the round face that showed everything she was thinking, even when she was trying to control it, at the woman who had screamed 3 words across a crowded room and then walked home in the cold, with her chin up and her hands steady, and had not once in 4 days pretended to be anything other than exactly what she was. "I'm not sure passing through is something I still know how to do," he said. Something moved across her face. Not the near smile. Something more complicated and more honest than that. "That's not an answer," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." She turned back to the horse. Her hands resumed their work, and her voice was careful when she spoke again, the care of someone saying something true that they have been carrying and have decided to stop carrying alone. "I don't need you to stay," she said. "I want to say that clearly. We managed before you came, and we'll manage when you go, and I am not going to be the reason a man stays somewhere he doesn't want to be." "Rosalie, I'm not finished." She did not turn around. "I also want to say that the last 4 days you have been..." She stopped, started again. "You didn't have to do any of this. The debt you felt you owed me from the saloon was settled the first night when you walked me home. Everything after that was a choice. Every morning you stayed was a choice." Now she turned. "I noticed every one of them." The barn was very quiet. "I noticed every one of them too," Caleb said. She looked at him steadily. "So what does that mean?" "It means I'd like to stay," he said. "If staying is something you'd want." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who have just said true things and are sitting with the fact of having said them. "Ask me again in a month," Rosalie said finally. A small smile, the real one, not the near smile, the actual smile that changed her whole face. "When the crisis is over, and it's just ordinary life, and you've seen what ordinary life here looks like." "I've seen enough to form an opinion," Caleb said. "You've seen 4 days of emergency," she said. "Ask me again in a month." He nodded. It was a fair answer. It was characteristically an honest answer, and it was the kind of answer that a man who had spent 3 years making no promises to anyone could respect entirely. "A month," he said. She turned back to the mayor. "Good night, Mr. Rourke." "Good night, Miss Bennett." He went back to the loft and lay down in the dark, and did not think about the road even once. 3 days later, Victor Halston made his last move. Caleb should have anticipated it. He did anticipate it in the abstract, understood that a man like Victor did not simply accept a changed situation. But the specific form it took arrived sideways the way the most dangerous things did, from a direction he had been watching and one he had not. The direction he had not been watching was Gideon Price. The assessor had been invisible since the crowd assembled in the street. Caleb had assumed Price was calculating his exposure and adjusting his loyalties accordingly. The standard response of a man who has been bought when the buyer's credit collapses. But Price had not been calculating his exposure. He had been following Victor's final instruction. Teague brought the news at dawn, riding hard. "Price filed last night," Teague said. He was breathing fast from the ride. "Not the reassessment, something different. He filed an emergency abandonment claim on the Bennett property citing non-occupancy during a legally defined period." He looked at Caleb with the expression of a man reporting something he does not fully understand, but knows is bad. Roy Simmons apparently drafted it 2 weeks ago as a contingency. If the primary mechanism failed, the abandonment claim activates automatically. Victor's been sitting on it waiting to see if he needed it. Caleb was already moving. "When does it take effect?" 24 hours from filing. Price filed at 8 o'clock last night." Caleb stopped moving. He turned and looked at Teague. "That means we have until 8 o'clock tonight," Teague said. "Then the claim is legally active and the property is classified as abandoned and subject to immediate reassignment." "On what grounds does he claim non-occupancy?" "The 2 days Martha and Rosalie were on the trail to Millhaven," Teague said. "Price apparently had someone watching the property. They documented that the house was empty for 48 hours and no occupant was present." His jaw was tight. "It's a fabricated reading of the statute. The law requires 30 days of documented non-occupancy, not 48 hours. But by the time a court rules on the misapplication of the statute, Victor's people will have filed the reassignment claim and occupied the property themselves, and evicting an occupant from a disputed property takes months. Months in which the federal investigation is still pending and Martha and Rosalie are living." He stopped. "Where?" "Not here," Caleb said. "Not if Victor's men are coming at 8 o'clock." He went to the house. Martha was at the table with her coffee. She read his face the moment he came through the door and set the cup down with a careful, deliberate click that said she was controlling the reaction she would otherwise have. "Tell me," she said. He told her. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table, and then she said, "My father built this house. Thomas built it again with his own hands after the first one burned in the drought year. I have buried 2 people I loved from this property, and I have fed my daughter from this garden, and I am not—" Her voice did not break, but it came close. "I am not leaving this house." "Martha," Caleb said. "I am not leaving." "I know," he said. "That's not what I'm asking you to do." She looked up. "I'm asking you to trust me for the next 12 hours, he said. "That's all. 12 hours. Rosalie appeared in the doorway from the back room. She had heard. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set in the way he had come to recognize the way it set, when she had received bad news, and was already past the receiving of it, and into the response. "What do you need?" she said to Caleb. "I need to get to Cooper," Caleb said. "Or to whoever Cooper sent his rider to. The moment a federal investigation is formally opened, state and county mechanisms get suspended on the relevant properties. That's federal preemption. If Cooper's investigation is already open, and I can get documentation of that opening to a judge before 8 o'clock tonight." "The abandonment claim can't activate," Rosalie said. "Exactly." "Millhaven is 2 days," Martha said. "Not if I push it," Caleb said. "And not if Cooper's rider is already closer than Millhaven." He pulled on his coat. "Dalt told me there's a telegraph office in Harding, 40 miles east. If Cooper's investigation generated a federal communication, it may have come through Harding's telegraph office first. If I can get to Harding and get a copy of that communication. 40 miles in 12 hours, Rosalie said. She was doing the calculation, and he could see from her face that it was close, very close. Pepper's rested, Caleb said. She's faster than she looks. You'll need a better horse than Pepper, Rosalie said. And before he could respond, she had turned back into the room and come back with a set of reins that he recognized the bay in the far stall, Thomas Bennett's second horse, younger and longer-legged than the gray. Thomas raised him from a foal, she said. He's fast, he's smart, he won't quit on you. Caleb took the reins. Their fingers overlapped on the leather, and neither of them moved for a moment. Don't come back without it, she said. I won't, he said. He rode hard. The bay was everything Rosalie had said, fast and intelligent, and with the particular quality of a well-raised horse that understood the difference between a rider who was in a hurry and one who needed everything the animal had. The horse gave him everything it had. Caleb gave it back by riding smart, not burning the pace on the flat when he could hold it for the hills, not pushing past the animal's sustainable rhythm, reading the ground and the horse simultaneously, the way a man learned to do when the horse was the only thing between him and failing. 38 miles. 35. He was in Harding by noon with 2 hours of pushing to spare, and he went directly to the telegraph office, and the man behind the counter looked at him, the way telegraph clerks looked at men who arrived covered in road dust, moving like something urgent, with the practiced combination of efficiency and wariness of someone who had learned that riders in that condition usually meant something complicated was about to become his problem. I need to know if a communication came through from the Federal Land Office in Millhaven, Caleb said. In the last 48 hours, relating to a land investigation in Willow Creek County. The clerk looked at him. That's not public information, the clerk said. I understand that, Caleb said. He pulled the receipt, the official federal acknowledgement Rosalie had brought back from Cooper's office, and laid it on the counter. I'm not asking for the content. I'm asking for confirmation that a federal communication was transmitted, and if so, a dated receipt of transmission, which is public record. The clerk looked at the receipt. He looked at Caleb. He made the particular calculation of a man who understands the difference between protocol and obstruction, and has learned through experience that mistaking the second for the first tends to create the kind of problems that require explaining to people above him. He went to his files. He came back with a transmission receipt dated yesterday morning, 7:42 a.m., originating from the Millhaven Federal Land Office, marked Urgent Federal Survey Investigation, confirmed received by the District Federal Court Office in the capital. Caleb's eyes went to the timestamp. Yesterday morning, before the abandonment claim was filed last night. The investigation had been formally opened and communicated to the Federal District Court before Victor's contingency mechanism had activated. The preemption was real. The timeline held. He took the receipt and rode. He made it back to Willow Creek by 6:47 p.m. He knew the time because he had been watching the sky for the last 2 hours with the specific attention of a man for whom the color of the light had a direct relationship to whether he succeeded or failed. And when the rooftops of Willow Creek came into view, he knew he had time, not much but enough, and he rode through the main street at a pace that made people step back from the road and stare. He went to the county courthouse. The county judge, a man named Aldous Ferris, who had, Caleb had learned, managed the specific political acrobatics of being beholden to Victor Halston without being entirely corrupted by him, which placed him in the useful category of men who were looking for a way out, was still in his office at 6:50. Caleb laid 3 documents on the judge's desk. The federal receipt from Cooper's office, the transmission receipt from Harding, and Dalt's original note, which he had kept this entire time in his breast pocket, the handwritten record of Roy Simmons, explaining the voiding mechanism to an associate in the hardware store, with walls thin as excuses. He talked for 8 minutes. He did not waste a word. Judge Ferris read the documents while Caleb talked. His expression moved through several things. At 6:58, he picked up his pen and signed a judicial order suspending all pending county actions against the Bennett property, pending resolution of the federal investigation. At 7 o'clock, 1 hour before Price's abandonment claim would have activated, the suspension was on record. It was done. Victor Halston's last move had landed on empty ground. Caleb walked out of the courthouse and stood in the street for a moment and let the day fall off him. The bay was at the hitching post, breathing hard, and Caleb went to the horse first and ran a hand along its neck and said, "Good boy," with the specific sincerity of someone who means it completely. The horse turned its head and looked at him with the large, calm eye of an animal that has given what was asked and knows it. When he got to the Bennett property, the gate was open and Rosalie was standing in the yard. She must have seen him coming up the road because she was already at the gate, and she read his face before he pulled the horse to a stop, and she said, "You got it." "I got it," he said. She closed her eyes. Just for a second. 1 second of allowing herself to feel the full thing, the relief and the release and the weight lifting off of something she had been holding up for a long time. Then she opened them again and she said, "Come inside, Mama made coffee." He laughed. It surprised him, arrived without warning, real and full, the laugh of a man who has not laughed in long enough that the return of it feels like something recovered. Rosalie looked at him with the real smile, the full one, and something between them settled into a different shape than it had been before, inside. Martha heard him laugh and came to the kitchen doorway and looked at him with those clear, indomitable eyes and said, "Well, you look like a man who had a successful errand." "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said. She nodded once with the particular satisfaction of a woman whose confidence in a decision has been confirmed and turned back to the stove. The federal investigation opened formally 6 days later. Franklin Cooper arrived in Willow Creek with 2 associates and a mandate from the district court. And he was not a man who moved slowly once he was moving. He went through this county land records with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had been waiting his whole professional life for documentation, as complete as what Hector Garfield had compiled, and what he found confirmed everything the Bible's pages had recorded and extended it further. 23 fraudulent boundary adjustments, 11 voided deeds, 41 years of accumulated land theft, conducted with such careful incremental patience that each individual action had seemed in isolation, like a bureaucratic irregularity rather than a crime. Together they constituted the most comprehensive land fraud case in the district's history. Gideon Price cooperated within the first hour of his interview with Cooper. Roy Simmons lasted until the second day before his own cooperation was purchased by the specific currency of a reduced sentence recommendation. The sheriff submitted his resignation on the third morning without being asked. Victor Halston himself said nothing. He sat in the office above the main street of Willow Creek through the 6 days of the initial investigation, with the lights on and the door closed. And on the 7th morning, federal marshals came through that door, and Victor Halston walked out between them and into a waiting conveyance, and did not look at the town he had built and corrupted and controlled and finally lost. He looked straight ahead, even at the end composed. Even at the end, the practiced calm of a man who understood that some performances had to be maintained, regardless of the audience. Caleb watched from across the square. He did not feel satisfaction at the sight exactly. He felt something more complicated, the specific gravity of watching a long wrong finally answered, which was not the same as joy, and not the same as relief, but something in its own territory that carried weight. Teague appeared beside him. 23 properties, he said quietly. Cooper says every one of them has grounds for restoration or compensation. Going to take 2 years to sort through it all. Worth sorting, Caleb said. Yes, Teague agreed. It is. The town meeting that happened the following week was nothing like the assembled crowd on the street. It was smaller, deliberate, organized by Aldridge in the church, and its purpose was not reaction, but decision. What did Willow Creek want to do with what had just happened? How did a town that had been complicit in its own corruption begin the work of being something else? It was not a clean or simple meeting. There was anger at Victor, but also at each other at the years of looking away at the specific human failure of allowing fear to become habit. Clara Perch said things that were hard to hear. Hector said things that were harder. The minister said things that were hardest of all because they were the most accurate. Caleb sat in the back and said almost nothing. This was not his meeting. This was a town deciding what it was, and that was a decision that belonged to the people who were going to live with it, not to the man who had helped make it possible. But when Aldridge asked if anyone else wanted to speak before they closed, Caleb stood. "I've been in a lot of towns," he said. The room went quiet. "I've seen a lot of situations like this one, and I want to say something that I think is true, even if it's hard to hear." He looked around the room. "You were afraid. Most of you were afraid for a long time, and you made choices out of that fear that you're going to have to live with. That's real, and it matters." He paused. "But fear is not the same as corruption. Victor Halston was corrupt. Roy Simmons was corrupt. Price was corrupt. The rest of you were afraid. And when the moment came that made it possible to not be afraid, most of you weren't." The room was very quiet. "That matters too," Caleb said. "Don't let the years of fear erase the moment of standing. Build on the standing." He sat down. Aldridge closed the meeting. Outside afterward, Rosalie found him. It had been 3 weeks and 2 days since he had said, "Ask me again in a month," and she had said a month, and neither of them had mentioned it. And now she walked up to him in the evening cold outside the church, with her hands in her coat pockets, and looked at him with her direct dark eyes. "You said a month," she said. "I remember." "It's been 3 weeks and 2 days. "I remember that too." She studied him. "Have you seen enough of ordinary life? I thought about the fence posts, and the kitchen table, and Martha's cooking, and Chester's old gray head, and the specific quality of the Bennett property in the early morning, when the light came over the ridge and landed on everything that Thomas and Martha and Rosalie had built and kept and refused to surrender." He thought about supper conversations, and the sound of Rosalie laughing at something Chester did, and the way she looked when she was reading her grandfather's pages in the lamplight, her face moving through grief and pride and love, in the specific mixture that only the dead we love can produce in us. I thought about what ordinary life here looked like. He had seen enough of it. "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a moment, then, and I'd like to stay," he said. "If that's still something you'd want." Rosalie Bennett looked at him for a long moment in the cold evening air. The woman who had screamed 3 words across a crowded saloon when every person in that room had decided to look away. The woman who had ridden 2 days through rough country with 20 years of her grandfather's truth wrapped in oilcloth in her saddlebag. The woman who had pressed her shaking hands together and made them still again and again every time the fear arrived, and had gone forward anyway every single time. She pulled one hand from her coat pocket and held it out. Not dramatic, not tentative. Simply offered the hand of a woman who has made her decision and is not going to qualify it, or apologize for it, or surround it with conditions it doesn't need. Caleb took it. Her hand was warm, and her grip was firm, and she did not let go, and neither did he, and they stood there in the cold outside the church, where a town had finally found its voice, and in the Bennett house up the North Road, Martha was at the stove making something that smelled like the particular comfort of a woman who has been worrying about 2 specific people for several weeks, and has just received information that allows her to stop. In the weeks that followed, Caleb Rourke stopped being the man who was passing through. He fixed the barn roof that had been needing it since before Thomas died. He built a new gate on the south fence that swung true and latched properly, because the old one had been binding for years, and Rosalie had been lifting it, rather than swinging it out of habit so long she had stopped noticing it wasn't right. He went into town and had conversations that were not tactical and did not involve extracting information, just the ordinary conversations of a man who is beginning to belong to a place. He talked to Teague about soil and weather and the specific management of the North Range. He had coffee with Dalt 3 mornings a week, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with Victor Halston, because Victor Halston was finished, and Dalt had opinions about matters considerably more interesting than finished men. He got to know Chester with the patient affection of someone who understood that old and deaf did not mean diminished, only different, and Chester returned the favor by moving his sleeping spot from the far corner of the barn to directly outside the loft stairs, which Rosalie said was the highest honor Chester had bestowed on anyone since Thomas. One evening about 6 weeks after Victor's arrest, Caleb was sitting on the porch with Rosalie and Martha, and the specific comfortable silence of 3 people who have been through something together and have come out the other side into ordinary life, and found somewhat to their own surprise, that ordinary life was enough, more than enough. Martha looked up from her mending and said without particular preamble, "My father would have called this justice." "I think so," Rosalie said. "I think he'd have said something more plain than that," Caleb said. Martha looked at him. What would he have said? Caleb thought about it. About an old cavalry veteran who had walked survey lines for 20 years and documented wrong with the patient precision of a man who believed without evidence in the immediate term that the truth was patient enough to outlast the lie. Who had trusted his daughter to keep it safe. Who had trusted that someday the right people would be in the right place at the right time to use it. He would have said it came out right, Caleb said. That's all. Just that it came out right. Martha was quiet for a moment. Then she went back to her mending, and the night came down over the Bennett property, and the creek moved over its stones in the dark, and Chester made his slow way up the porch steps to put his gray muzzle on Rosalie's knee, and Rosalie put her hand on his head and looked at Caleb across the dark porch with her dark, direct eyes. He looked back at her. No calculation, no assessment. Just the simple, clear-eyed look of two people who have come through fire together and found each other standing on the other side of it, and have decided that standing in the same place is where they intend to stay. Some things did not need words. This was one of them. Cooper's investigation concluded 8 months later with federal charges filed against Victor Halston, Roy Simmons, and Gideon Price. All three were convicted. All 23 fraudulent boundary adjustments were reversed. 11 properties were restored to their original owners or their heirs. The Bennett property was confirmed in full creek access intact, every survey marker standing exactly where Hector Garfield had placed them 20 years before. The new county assessor was Teague, who had not sought the position and accepted it only after 12 people came to his door in the same week to ask him to. The new sheriff was a man from 2 counties over who had never met Victor Halston and had no arrangements with anyone. Willow Creek did not become a perfect town. It became a better one. Which was, Caleb had come to understand, the only honest version of what towns and people could aspire to. Not perfection. Not the erasure of the years they had looked away. Just the steady daily work of being better than they had been. He understood that from the inside now, because he was part of the inside. Not passing through. Not a stranger calculating his exit. A man who woke up in the morning knowing where he was and had no desire to be anywhere else. The day the final federal ruling came through, Rosalie found him repairing the kitchen window frame that had been swelling in the damp for 2 winters. She stood in the doorway and read him the ruling from the document Cooper had sent, and when she was done, she folded it and held it against her chest for a moment with her eyes closed. Caleb set down his tools and waited. She opened her eyes and looked at him, and he saw in her face the thing he had first seen in the saloon, the courage that was not the absence of fear, but the decision made in spite of it, returned now in a different form. Quieter, more settled, belonging to a woman who had come through the fire and knew the shape of herself and was not afraid of it. He was right, she said. My grandfather. He said the truth was patient enough to outlast the lie. He was right, Caleb said. So were you, she said, when you stayed. He crossed the kitchen, and he did not say anything because there was nothing to say that was not already understood between 2 people who had earned each other through the specific and irreplaceable currency of showing up. When showing up was hard. I took the document gently from her hands and set it on the table, and he looked at her, this woman who had screamed across a crowded room to save a stranger, and changed both their lives in the doing of it. And what he felt was not the complicated grief of a man running from his past, and not the hollow restlessness of a man with nowhere to be. What he felt was simple, solid, like a fence post driven flush into good ground planted to stay. And for Caleb Rourke, the man who had spent 3 years disappearing from everything that mattered, standing still in the kitchen of the Bennett house, with the woman who had refused to let him die on a Tuesday night in a frontier saloon standing still, was the bravest and most deliberate thing he had ever done. He was home, and this time he was not leaving.